Welcome to my EC&I 842 visual project. Often in science class I will add simple stick people illustrations to help understand the notes better. Stick people are quick and simple to draw, and that way my students can also copy the illustrations down without worrying about their own abilities to draw. Mine aren't great anyway. So I decided to explore some new video capture software on my computer and illustrate my project. Hope you enjoy it. Near the start of this class, we read an article by Lynn White called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. It looked at the Christian perspective of how we've gotten into the ecological crisis that we currently have. And I often find myself at odds with other Christians when it comes to environmental practices, so I felt for this project I would explore that. I got to wondering why it was that I had such a different view than so many people that I share so many other aspects of my life with and behavior with. And I wondered, what determines Christian environmental behavior anyway? Now you may recall that Lynn White had an idea in the 1960s that the reason why everyone, not just Christians, behaved the way they did towards the environment in the 1960s was due to the Christian belief structure that had formed so much of the Western world's policies. Basically, he thought that Christian doctrines were at the root of this crisis. And this came from the fact that, first of all, humans were given dominion over the earth. It's yours to rule. And then they despiritualized everything through the destruction of animism, making the world just natural and not spiritual anymore. He argued that once Christianity had become widespread and had made it so that people no longer viewed nature as spiritual or sacred, that made it so that people could exploit it in the name of God. It's a compelling narrative, and I can see it still being borne out today in our society. While the religious motives behind it would be denied by most people, the habits it established has been ingrained in our society. We must maximize profit. The economy must be served. None shall be asked to sacrifice for the environment. Some may be asked to sacrifice for the economy, though. And we can see this in the headlines that happen in our society today. So if this is all of society, are Christians actually worse at this then? Well, in a study of opinions in the United States, 45% of those who do not believe in climate change are evangelical Christians, while only 14% of those who do believe in climate change are evangelical Christians. That's quite a difference. Some sociologists wondered what it was that was really driving this anti-environmental behavior, since it seemed inconsistent. While many Christians behaved this way, not all of them did. Was there some other thing that was determining their behavior? So they had them fill out a massive survey that looked at a whole range of their beliefs. And they looked at three key areas. How aware were they of negative biospheric consequences? How aware were they of negative consequences to themselves of climate change? And how aware were they of negative consequences to others of climate change? After surveying the Christians about their beliefs, they found that it was really as simple as those that had a poor understanding of the biosphere were more likely to be anti-climate change. So why is it that Christians have this discrepancy in their understanding of the biospheric science when compared with the general public? One Christian writer for Christianity Today posited the theory that the reason most evangelical Christians do not know the science is because they do not trust the scientists. The reason they don't trust the scientists is that often the scientists will say things like hundreds of thousands of years of data or climate millions of years ago, and as soon as they hear these things, their brain says, I don't trust this guy because I believe the earth is young. Therefore, I can safely ignore everything he just said. And while many Christians don't think that the world is young, among evangelical Christians, this is still a very common belief. This discrepancy in evangelical understanding versus the general public has become somewhat of a topic of interest among scientists. Everyone wants to know how to bring the evangelicals on board, especially since they often vote as a bloc and make up 30% of the American population. One group of researchers went as far as arranging for 3 different kinds of presentations to a group of 88 evangelical Christian students at an evangelical university in the United States. The first group was shown a live presentation by a climate scientist who believed in climate change and who was also a strong evangelical Christian. The second group was shown the same presentation, but also with common misconceptions included, and the third was just shown a recording of the first presentation. All three groups reported that they were more pro-climate after the presentations than before. Possible conclusions were that the focus on recent data did not cause the Christians to dismiss the data. The shared faith built trust in the data. Also, the fact that the recording worked as well means that it's cheaper and more environmentally friendly to educate Christians. Last thing, not adding the common misconceptions avoided the backfire effect. So now we have an idea of how to educate evangelical Christians, but does that mean that Christian belief is inherently bad for the environment? Well, many atheists and others will argue that it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There could be another way. So recall that the reason why many Christians behave the way they do is because they see the world as fallen. It's no longer perfect, but it's now sinful. And that it's still theirs to rule, though, with the goal of having people come to know God. And so caring for creation becomes a distant second goal. Also, the fallen world is eventually going to be destroyed anyway, many of them believe, and replaced with a new heaven, a new earth. So why bother taking care of this one? Well, that's the traditional view. Lynn White himself even didn't think that that was how it had to be. He liked the idea of going back and looking at how St. Francis approached nature. He believed everything in nature was to glorify God. And if the way you approach something in nature kept it from this, then you likely weren't using God's creation correctly. David Lee went back and looked at church history, and he came up with a couple of conclusions. First of all, he said, if we are to embrace the position that nature has value in itself and not simply as a resource for human beings or simply as a source of human experience, we must pull away from both the Old Testament position, which was of us as stewards, and the humanist position, which was that we can do with it as we want, which have colored Western thought. Environmental consciousness, which recognizes an overwhelming value that is independent of human concerns and human designs, can only develop from a consciousness that perceives ultimate value in the order and harmony of a cosmos and essentially intends to leave that undisturbed. This appropriate response to create order was indeed prominent in medieval Christianity with its Neoplatonic and Aristotelian elements, and of course in the dominant Hellenic philosophy of Aristotle and Plato, where we find strong emphasis upon the role of reason in its contemplative rather than practical aspect. In other words, he believed we need to return to our contemplative roots. Martin Ashley contends that we must be careful of the pendulum swing. Many Christians right now have a theology of anthropocentrism, which states nature and all of creation were created for man's good. We must be careful from swinging to all things of nature are good, and we must only serve nature, or ecocentrism. Science has shown that nature is amoral. It is neither good nor bad, it simply is. Instead, an awe and wonder of nature needs to be instilled. We need to approach nature in the same way we approach God, with awe and reverence, which means respect. It is as Mr. Beaver explained to Susan in Narnia, when she found out that Aslan was a lion. She asked, "Is he safe?" And Mr. Beaver responded, "No, but he is very good." In developing this kind of view of God, Christians will then apply this to creation and respect nature again. Martha Kirkpatrick re-examines the idea of incarnation, which simply means God filling a physical form. Jesus Christ was deity that fully inhabited became material being, human. In order to redeem creation, God took on material form. She uses this to set up incarnational ecology. We are part of creation, and God chose to be part of creation to live within its constraints. An incarnational ecology helps us realize that we stand not above, but in the world, and hence are subject to the Earth's laws and must live within its limits. Susan Bratton doesn't re-examine the theology, but instead teaches students to reflect on what they actually believe and to think about the ethics of it. By combining religious reflection onto scientific concepts, and vice versa, students learn to not isolate the strengths that both fields offer. This bridges the intellectual barriers between the two, and when combined with environmental science, it also bridges the human world, buildings, and the natural world. This allows nature to become sacred in the mind of Christians again, and it becomes worth protecting. Lloyd Stephen believed that even within the old Christian view, there was still good if restraint was applied. He views the concept of dominion presented in Genesis 1:28 as being the kind of dominion that King Solomon is described as having. King Solomon had peace on all sides. He used his rule and dominion not to dominate, but to seek peace, justice, and safety for all. If that is what God meant when he told man to have dominion, then we should be seeking safety, peace, and justice for all of creation. And while this idea, called stewardship, has its detractors, it is definitely better than the exploitation we currently have.
I've always been a person who thinks a lot about what they believe and what this actually means for how they live. If I don't act on something, do I really believe it? So what do I personally make of all this? What difference will it make in my teaching?
First, it reinforces some of the practices I have already had with my environmental science class. I have since the beginning of the class tried to bring in ethics since I wanted them to look beyond some of their biases. The first part of ethics was looking at evidence. We discussed the importance of looking at consequences instead of good or bad statements. This has made it easier for them to view the wider picture. For example, we examined Yellowstone Park and looked at how reintroducing wolves has actually helped out the entire ecosystem. The elk migrate more now and no longer overgraze. The willow trees grew back near the rivers, erosion stopped, the habitats for other animals increased, and the faster rivers led to more beavers and even more habitat. This is called a trophic cascade. Once they understood consequences instead of good versus bad, we could discuss why we make the decisions we do. Every decision will be good for some and bad for others, so this is where ethics comes in. What I now realize I need to increase is connecting it back to their personal beliefs. Now, in my case, I work in a Christian school, so I can easily have them look at passages from the Bible to examine how God related to nature. And now, thanks to looking at other ways of framing this relationship, I can help them reestablish a healthier relationship with nature. This is something I plan on doing in the next few weeks. And this is only a beginning for me. This is my first year teaching environmental science, but I want to re-examine how I do all of my sciences. I think bringing in more ethics and reflection into each of them will improve the application to the students' lives.